Happy Easter, everyone. What you're about to experience is the creative telling of the story of Matthew, one of Jesus' 12 disciples and the author of one of the 4 Gospels. We chose Matthew because he reminds us of ourselves, someone looking for life beyond what we've known, looking for hope that's stronger than our fears. And to craft this Easter message, we relied on historical documents, including scriptures and our own imaginations. We want to understand Matthew better, but more importantly, we want to understand his rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. We're so glad you're with us this morning. So go ahead and silence your phone, sit back, and experience Easter through the eyes of a first-century man named Matthew.
Matthew, according to Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew. Of all the things that I ever thought I'd be, being a writer was at the bottom of the list. I'm more of a numbers guy, facts and figures, the bottom line, black and white, the easily explained. I used to have a shelf in the back of my office, and I put all my scrolls there. I put them in a very perfect place, and neat and organized. I always bought the same kind of papyri, and I always used the same color of ink. That was predictable, but I had to be because life had been anything but. I was the only child of a simple Jewish family in the fishing village of Capernaum. No, my father, he wasn't a fisherman. He ran a small business, and he taught me how to read and to do calculations. There was this beautiful synagogue in the center of Capernaum. Oh, it was a really great place. My parents, they used to bring me there when I was young, but I hadn't set foot in there since I was an adult. I must have been hardly a boy when they died. There was a sickness that went through the village. It actually went from village to village, a fever that took victims as it went from house to house. My father was the first to go, and my mother, she kept me out of his room while she took care of him, and then she went next. They were buried in a family tomb in rocks on the outskirts of Capernaum. He is gathered to his fathers, the rabbi said. She rests in the peace of her people. No, I remember saying to myself, they're gone. They're gone. And this place, this isn't a place to experience peace. I remember when they rolled the stone back into place, I couldn't breathe. I started to panic a little bit, and my eyes were fixed on that stone for what seemed like hours. The sun set, I became cold, I shivered, and like a good Jewish boy, I just started saying the prayers that the Jews would say at a time like that, and then I stopped. I said something to God or whoever it was. It was a little less filtered. I will not forget this. So I grew a shell that day, and I don't know whether it was convincing, but I kept adding layers to it. I moved out of my family home. I bought a new home. I took on a new job. Well, one that my father wouldn't have approved of. I walked into the Roman consul, and I paid the necessary fee and showed that I had the relevant skills to be a tax collector. When I walked out with the papers in hand that showed my new status, it was like I had burned every bridge to the way that I was raised. Now, to be a Jew and to work for the Romans, the enemy of our people, our occupiers with their many gods and hedonistic ways, that's tantamount to taking a box and standing out in the middle of town and saying that I renounce my heritage. I renounce my identity. It's like renouncing your grandmother. My parents would have been so ashamed. But I was angry. I was angry at my community. I was angry at my religion for seemingly failing me. I was angry at my parents for being gone. And as for God, well, I wasn't even sure if he existed anymore, but if he did, I didn't want anything to do with him. It was time for me to look out for me. If I earned enough, if I built enough, if I protected enough, then I would be safe, I thought. I was after security in work, in money, in comforts, in a nice house with tall walls around me and a soft carpet. There I lived, and I ate my meals, and I slept safe. Safe and alone. Now, I know that it's pretty common knowledge that tax collectors are extortionists. I know you've never heard that before. But what you had to do is you had to give your Romans a certain quota, the Roman bosses a certain quota, and if you just happened upon any extra cash, they would look the other way. It was the silver lining, literally, to fleecing my own people. I started out honest at first, but eventually the money, it got to me. And I remember taking a little extra than was due from the honest tradespeople and the honest merchants that were my neighbors. But what were they going to do? You know, I had the Roman government behind me. So I worked, and I took all of the right steps. I made friends with all of the right people. And by midlife, I was where I wanted to be. Although I wouldn't say that I was satisfied. I was anxious. I was unsettled. I was uneasy. Sometimes I worry that the only thing that I will ever be known as, no matter what I do, is Matthew the tax collector. It's true. It's what I was, but not anymore. How about Matthew the writer? Well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I had heard about this rabbi named Jesus. He was a nobody. He didn't learn under anybody famous. He was from this town, Nazareth. That was the kind of place that you didn't want people to know that you were from. He had no wife. He had no kids. It's kind of like me. Rumor had it that he actually healed somebody in Capernaum, the mother-in-law of a well-liked fisherman, of a fever. There are also rumors that his teaching wasn't very popular among some of the Jewish elite, but what did I care? I hadn't set foot in a synagogue in years. And besides, I don't even think they would let me go if I wanted to. As for God and I, what did we have to say to each other? Well, I felt stuck. Everything was the same, but something just felt wrong. It's like kind of ironic because God was the last person that I would have ever turned to. I was sitting in my booth on the road from Damascus to Jerusalem one day, and I started to notice that there were lots of people moving by in groups, all in the same direction, with absolutely nothing taxable, mind you. And I watched them go by, and I overheard somebody say that they were going to hear Jesus speak. So on a whim, I went to hear Jesus speak. Now, I wouldn't say that I was really seeking anything. I didn't really have any spiritual motivations, just as some of you might not today. But have you ever gone home to your house full of stuff and felt cold and empty inside? No. Have you ever? Most of us have. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and felt anxious and you weren't sure why? Have you ever just wondered where life was going? Well, if you've ever felt those things, then you were like I was on that day, that I settled onto a warm patch of grass to hear Jesus speak. His students were sitting up around his feet. There were just regular guys and some women too. And people spilled all over the hill. The lake, the breeze that kind of came across the lake, it seemed to carry his voice up to us. It was a pretty unconventional sermon, to say the least. Jesus started out by saying things like, "Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who mourn." I wanted to tell him mourning, and there is nothing great about mourning. Then he started to rail against the hypocrites, those people who paid great deals of money in order to improve their reputation, people who prayed in public, but then did terrible things in secret. I found myself nodding. It was actually kind of refreshing to hear a rabbi talk about these things. The kind of religion that Jesus was against was the kind of religion that I was against. Love your enemies as yourself, he said. If you only love those who are kind to you, what good is it to you? Even the tax collectors do that. Okay. Could I go anywhere without being mocked for my profession? And why did it still sting? And then Jesus said what really stuck with me. Don't gather treasures on earth where everything will fall apart. Instead, gather treasures in heaven where nothing will rust or decay or be stolen from you. Where nothing will rust or decay or be stolen from you? Was there a place like that? Were there treasures that could be obtained like that? I had a lot of money, and I had bought a lot of things. I had many treasures, but nothing like that. Jesus' words, they nagged at me for a while, and for really a couple of days, and I started to ask myself, where is my heart? Do I have things that would add up to a worthwhile life? But after a while, I just took those feelings and I pushed them aside. I wouldn't see Jesus again, at least for a couple weeks. I was sitting in my tax booth and I was just lost in thought, staring into nowhere, which was actually a pretty good metaphor for my life at the time. And somebody cleared their throat and I looked up and there was Jesus. His arms were folded and it seemed like he was studying me. I had this impression that Jesus had been there for some time without me noticing. I had this impression that Jesus had been there my entire life without me noticing. He was close enough for me to see the dirt on his garment and the stubble on his untrimmed beard. And he looked at me in the eye, and he didn't even introduce himself, and he said this, "Follow me." And I said nothing. Maybe you're at the wrong booth. Why would a rabbi call me? But after months of indecision, something finally became clear to me. I didn't want to be in this booth, this life anymore. And I didn't know the way out. So I thought maybe this man did. I stood up, I nodded, and I followed Jesus into the afternoon light. And I felt lighter. I didn't know what following him would really mean, but suddenly I became afraid that he would change his mind. So I grabbed him by the arm and I said, "Jesus, come to my house for dinner tonight. You can bring anyone you want." And Jesus smiled and he looked at me as if to say, "All right, let's go." So I ran off with a purpose. I knocked on every door of the few friends that I had, tax collectors, people who did backdoor deals with confiscated goods, a guy who collected information for the Romans. "Please come with me to dinner tonight," I pleaded with them. "It will be a feast." And I invited the Rabbi Jesus. That raised some eyebrows, but hey, a feast is a feast. And when evening arrived, they came. My few friends came to drink up my wine cellar and eat at my table. And Jesus and his friends came. Oh man, it was one of the most awkward mixes that you had ever seen. But something that I learned about Jesus was that he was a natural. He was a natural with anyone and anywhere. He came right in, he grabbed a cup, and he started talking to people. And if his disciples, if they were more hesitant, well, they quickly followed suit as well. My dining room was filled with animated conversation and laughter. I know that it was just the beginning, but I will never forget that night. Jesus had come to me. Well, as I took my guests out for the night, we found out that we had an audience. There were people from the temple standing outside, looking at us and glaring at us with judgment and indignation. Jesus greeted them as he passed by with the disciples trailing. And as they passed by, one of the Pharisees shouted out, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" My good mood immediately evaporated. All that shame, it just came flooding back in. Well, Jesus, he turned around to ask them a question. Who needs a doctor? The healthy or the sick? Go and study the scriptures that say, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I've come to call sinners. Sinners, the sick, the broken. These were the people that were drawn to Jesus. The people that couldn't tolerate him. They were the people that couldn't admit that they had any needs or that they had ever done anything wrong. So when Jesus and his disciples packed up and decided to move on from Capernaum, well, I went with them. And when Jesus selected 12 men to be closest to him and he gave them authority to do extraordinary things like healings and cleansings and transforming people's lives, I was one of them too. Unlikely? Absolutely. Of course. I was the least likely of them all. I didn't fit in with the local guys, especially the fishermen. It took us some time to trust each other and to care for each other. But there was no turning back. We all agreed on that. What Jesus was about wasn't religion. It was life. Life beyond wealth. Life beyond status. Life beyond anything that we had ever known. And we needed it. I needed it. The funny thing is that before we started traveling with Jesus, before I started traveling with Jesus, my life had been safer. I had financial security. I had the protection of a job. I had the comforts of a home. But being with Jesus, as unpredictable as it was, gave me a kind of security that I'd never experienced before. I had less, but I lived more. I saw more. I felt more. And it was like a part of me that I had locked away started to open up for the first time. We were sitting around a campfire one day and swapping stories, and somebody asked me, "Hey, Matthew, where's your family?" All the eyes looked on me, including Jesus. "They're gone," I said. "It was a long time ago." I quickly told them the story. I didn't want people to think that my story was any harder or any easier than theirs. And then everything was quiet. Jesus seemed to be angry. But he wasn't angry at me. It was like he was angry at the kind of broken system, the kind of world where we lose people. It was like he was angry at us trying to heal pain, but being unsuccessful. It was like he was angry at death. What did God and I have to say to one another? Well, it turns out a lot. Just recently, after Jesus spent some time in prayer, he announced that we would be going to Jerusalem for the Passover. Some of the guys were really excited about it, but I was on edge. Don't get me wrong, Jerusalem it's a beautiful place. It's glamorous, really. It's a place to be seen. It's a place to spend money. It's a place, of course, to worship as well. But Jerusalem is also a place where politics play out, and that isn't always pretty. And the temple is no exception to that. Jesus' messages were starting to get more grim and ominous as well. One day he pulled us aside on the road in the afternoon in the open sun as Jerusalem was rising up in front of us, and he said, "Jerusalem is near. The Son of Man will be delivered unto the chief priests and the scribes, and he will be condemned to death, and they will deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked, to be flogged, to be crucified. And on the third day, he will rise again." We all looked at each other, and I looked to Peter because Peter seemed to understand Jesus better than the rest of us. Peter said, "How about we not go?" A knot formed in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I didn't like it when Jesus talked about death. It brought back all of these terrible memories from my childhood. Jesus was alive. He was vibrant. He was healthy. I needed him. I trusted him not to leave. But Jesus wouldn't be deterred. The rest of that week is a little bit blurry to me. As we entered into the city, it was with a great deal of fanfare. People raised their palm branches high. Somebody said, "Hosanna." Somebody said, "The Son of David." Another person shouted, "Hosanna." Jesus was teaching us when we arrived in the city relentlessly, almost as if he was preparing us for a final test. Then the night of that Passover, I remember it really clearly. Jesus whispered something into Judas's ear, and then Judas disappeared. Us disciples, we were trying to figure out what was going on, and then Jesus invited us to go to one of his favorite places to pray. And he asked us to stay up with him and pray. But the week had been so busy, and we were just exhausted. It was dark and quiet in the world, and I fell asleep. I awoke to find Judas there with other men who would do terrible things to Jesus. Now maybe you heard. Judas sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Most people have a hard time understanding how somebody could make a decision like that. But I chased money my entire life. And by the time that you realize that it doesn't deliver on what it promises, you can't stop. It's astonishing what people will do for money. I tried to be brave that day. I stuck with the people in the crowds at Pilate's courts. I followed the procession outside of town. "Follow me," Jesus had said. But when they started nailing him to that cross, I couldn't breathe. I panicked. I ran. How could this be happening? "Where your treasure is," you said. "Where nothing will rust or decay," you said. Jesus, you were supposed to fix this. You were supposed to save us and not die and not leave me alone like everyone else did. It was a nightmare. It was like all of those memories came back, flooding my mind. We found ourselves back in that upper room where we had had our last family meal together, and we locked the doors and jumped every time we heard a voice. I couldn't sleep. I had barely eaten anything. It was like death was coming for us all. But on the third day, something happened. The women, they went up to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus. I couldn't go. I would find no peace in a place like that. Now, I know that people are different, but graves are all the same, or at least so I thought. The women, they came back from the tomb, and they said that but the rock that had sealed the tomb had been rolled away as if it was nothing, and the tomb was empty. They said that they saw an angel who said to them, "He is not here. He is risen. Go and tell the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee." Risen? Of course, we didn't believe it at first. I mean, who had ever by themselves risen from the dead? But we started to remember everything that Jesus said from the very beginning. And I know that we didn't always understand what Jesus meant, but everything that he had said had come true. What about this? Peter and John, they rushed to the tomb to check it out for themselves. I wasn't sure. I'd much prefer a tomb that's occupied than a tomb that's empty. At least you know where the body is at. At least you know where the end of the story is. Peter and John came back and they confirmed that the tomb was empty, but they saw no one in sight. Where was the body? Well, that started a debate among us disciples, and our argument continued into the afternoon when suddenly we saw Jesus there, standing in our midst in the locked room. It was like that time back in the booth. It was like he had always been there and he was just waiting for us to see him. It looked like him. Peace be with you. It sounded like him. But who could experience peace at a time like this? But I have to say, when I saw him, I felt relieved. It was like everything was going to be okay. Maybe it wasn't going to be the way that I had planned, and maybe it wasn't going to be the way that I understood, but that was still going to be okay. Jesus disappeared almost as quickly as he came. But I slept that night. I wasn't afraid. I had a sense that there was something more coming. And the following Sunday, Jesus appeared to us again. Thomas was with us now. Thomas wasn't with us before, and he was reluctant to accept what we told him about Jesus. But eventually, we all started to believe. Jesus died, just as he said. Jesus was raised, just as he said. If Jesus fought death and won, that changes the meaning of death. That changes the meaning of life. So, here I find myself, back in Galilee, back in Capernaum with a blank page in front of me and a new color of ink. Because if Jesus is here, I have a story to tell, a story that changes everything. Because if a stone is nothing, and if Jesus fought death and won, if death doesn't win, then I'm free to live. And so are you.